Welcome to week 10 of the QUT Design Lab series of videos supporting our program based on Wendy Laura Belcher's second edition of Writing Your Journal Article in 12 Weeks. I acknowledge the Turrbal and Yugara peoples as the traditional custodians of the unceded lands in Meanjin, where I'm recording this. And I recognise that these lands and waterways have always been places of teaching, learning, research, creativity, storytelling, and arts. I'm your writing wellbeing coach, Dr. Abby Winter. And this week we're talking about the opening and conclusion of your article. But first, of course, our weekly writing reflection. Take a moment and think about who might be your ideal reader. What will they learn from your work? How might they use that learning? That first question comes from Rachel Cayley's blog, Explorations of Style, while the second and third are from Robin Bernstein's Chronicle of Higher Education article, Can You Reverse a Defeatist Habit? Okay, this week we are talking about the microstructure of your article and the first part of cohesion, topping and tailing your piece with a strong start and big bang finish. But before we start, Belcher takes the opportunity to remind us that even once we've submitted our piece, we'll still get another chance to improve it when the reviews come back. So don't get too tied up in knots about trying to make it perfect right now. She also reminds us that most readers, including reviewers, are going to look at your title, then your abstract. If you're lucky, they'll read a bit of your introduction and skim through it. So it's really important to have your argument, approach, contribution, and relevance clearly stated up front at the start of the article. As she says on page 282, articles with strong titles, solid abstracts, and compelling introductions are more likely to be accepted for publication, more likely to be read, and more likely to be cited. So, first up, your title is critical. Helen Sword did some research a few years ago about what makes a good title, and that she found that you can be a bit funny but not too clever. You can be fairly long, up to about 15 to 20 words in total. And the really good titles have a colon. So you can have your cleverness, but then still describe exactly what your article's about. Belcher also has a few hints about titles. Firstly, make sure your title is specific and not vague or abstract. One of her examples on page 284 is, rather than Gender, Women and Twitter, to call it Girl Code, Performing Gender in Women's Twitter Profiles. Don't include a question mark. I think a couple of weeks ago, we talked about not asking questions you don't immediately answer in the text. The same holds true for the title. Think about whether you need to name your subject. Does the Royal Commission need to be in there, for example? Also, she suggests jamming as many keywords in there as possible. You want your title to be searchable and findable. But make sure that it still makes sense as a standalone thing, not just a string of keywords. Belcher suggests that the best way to do this is to rework it until there are no commas left in the title. She also suggests trying to get a verb in there, often by adding ing to a word. Tracing, exploring, revisiting. Try to avoid starting your title with non-English words, because our quick skim readers might make an assumption that the article is in that other language, and you're either going to disappoint them or make them skip your piece entirely. If you can make your title point to your argument, you're doing really well. And finally, make sure your title makes sense all on its own, because that's how most readers are going to find it. Next, we're going to talk about introductions. They have three main roles, which Belcher calls moves. First, as an entry point to give context. Secondly, to give your argument, your claims for significance. Finally, to provide a synopsis and point to your solution. Remember, we're not writing a mystery novel. Giving away your ending might be the best way to keep someone reading. So the best introduction begins with a compelling first sentence, not just a quote or a question. She suggests a few different types of compelling opening on pages 291 to 2, including an anecdote, an argument, or a bit of historical scene setting. She reminds us on page 292 that you're usually writing for people who know less than you do about the topic, and they may be reading your article long after you wrote it or in a different context. So it's important to give the context: who, what, where, when, why, how, what journalists call the 5 W's and an H. The next point Belcher makes is about your entry point, which is how your work relates to what's already out there. In the example she gives on page 293, she highlights keywords that indicate this position. Many researchers, nearly all of this work. An open question is, depending on how you structure your article, this may be a good place to point to your contextual evidence, or you may go deeper into your literature here. Your next job is to make it clear to your reader why this is important. Remember, the case for your significance of your work, why it matters, and to whom. Belcher's next suggestion is to give a synopsis of your piece up front, just like you do in a dissertation or presentation, because it helps your reader and is a useful piece of written signposting for them to follow. Her next suggestion is a tough one, but it's really good if you can manage it. It's called a pull quote. And it's basically the thing that you'd most like anyone to quote from your article. It might be your significance or your argument based on your elevator pitch, but it might also be something like a definition, which is the example that she uses in the book on page 295. She then goes through a few things to not do in your introduction, but I'm going to flip them a bit and give them to you as positives rather than negatives. Firstly, know your readers, current and future. Inga Mewburn, Catherine Firth, and Sean Lehman, in their 2019 book, How to Fix Your Academic Writing Trouble, recommend spending some time on a Venn diagram of your audience and what each of them know. That way you won't be giving too much or too little information, and you'll also be able to make sure your information and evidence is most relevant. Belcher's next suggestion is to do with establishing your authority in a disciplinary way. As she says on page 296, authors establish themselves as authorities through the style of their prose, their stance on field debates, their use of cutting-edge or traditional theories, the depth of their research, the aggression of their argumentation, the rigor of their method, their mastery of material, their self-reflexivity, or their humour. So know your field and its literature. Next, claim your ideas by using the first person. My conclusion is, I argue that. Then, avoid cliches. They're cliches for a reason, right? Because we all know them, so we don't really have to think too hard about them. Back 80-odd years ago, George Orwell wrote a lovely essay, which is one of the How to Be a Better Writer pieces that I always reread on January the 1st each year, where he argues that cliches should be dead and we should all spend a little time thinking of new metaphors and similes to use in our own writing. Finally, in establishing your authority, Belcher recommends thinking about your name and how it presents you, because you get to choose the name or names that you publish under. I made a decision early on to be Abigail Winter, but lately I've gone for the less formal Abby. I didn't want to go for AJ Winter, in part because that was my father-in-law, and in part because I wanted it to be known that I'm a woman writing. But there's nothing that says you have to publish under your legal name, so if you want to present yourself as the more ambiguous Chris rather than Christopher or Christine, go right ahead. Of course, whatever you do, make sure you always use your ORCID, so all of your publications point back to you, and do the other things you hopefully talked about in week 4 with your wonderful librarian or librarians. Put everything in your university's open access repository if it has one. Claim it in Google Scholar, and so on. Just because you're using multiple or different names, don't lose track of what's where. Belcher spends more time on the intrinsic and extrinsic reasons why you might want to use a name other than your given one to publish in, more than any other part of this week's chapter. So if you're thinking about that, I'd recommend reading pages 297 to 301. And finally, to your conclusion. Don't spend a huge amount of time here, but do try to tie it back into your key parts. Summarize your argument and its significance, as well as the wider implications of what you've written. Ideally, you'll be making recommendations for the practice within your discipline, as well as out in the real world of work. Your so what of why any of this matters and for whom. If you're struggling with the conclusion, if you're up to that part of your piece, Belcher recommends asking a couple of friends and or colleagues to quickly read your article and tell you what it's about and why it's important. Hearing it back in a voice other than your own can sometimes be all the prompt we need to find the words to make that final argument. On page 302, she's got a checklist for your title, on page 303 for your introduction, and on page 305 for your conclusion. She ends with 2 notes on author order. First, if you agreed the author order early, that doesn't mean you have to be tied to it. If the workload ended up differently than everyone expected, take account of that. Secondly, she makes the point that co-authored articles are becoming more likely to be accepted, published, and cited than sole author ones, although of course there will be disciplinary differences. And finally, a few quick thoughts about your abstract. She suggests that your title is the billboard and the abstract is your full-page magazine ad. You need to optimize your abstract, make sure it's packed with keywords so that your piece can be searched and found, and use every word available to you. Most importantly, go back to it once you've finished writing and make sure it reflects the final version of your piece and its argument, because we often draft that abstract early and don't revisit it. At the same time, look for other critical things you might have changed in the piece but not in the abstract, like any key literature or theorists you've brought in as evidence, as well as any changes you might have made to the structure. And that's us for this week. As always, please take out your calendar and plan your writing for next week. In next week's video from chapter 11 of Belcher's book, we're going to be looking at the cohesion side of the microstructure, and in particular the fiddly things like grammar. And Belcher provides a lovely macro for a diagnostic test to run over your writing. So for that, if you're doing this program through the QUT Design Lab, your homework is to email through your introduction as it stands. Remember to schedule and track your writing time, and I'll see you next time.